very pleased to have Dr. Yanis Varoufakis with us today. So I'd like to start by thanking him for joining us today. And I should also thank Professor Fuat Keyman and the Istanbul Policy Center for making this possible. I see IPC, IPM people back there, so thanks a lot. So I'll be very brief introducing Yanis Varoufakis, who needs no introduction for most of us, but I'll be doing that anyways. So after his speech, we'll have a Q&A session. So let me start. Dr. Varoufakis is an economist, academic, and a public intellectual who's known globally for his views and position on critical matters for society. He earned his PhD in economics in Essex, but let me mention that before that, he had a mathematics degree. Bachelor's, and then mathematical statistics in master's. Okay. So he held various academic positions worldwide, including at Essex, Cambridge, Glasgow, Sydney, Texas, and Athens. And I learned yesterday that he's currently teaching at Athens to a large group of first-year students and late graduate students, right? Second year. Okay. So, of course, one reason we all know Yanis Varoufakis very well is because of his finance minister position in 2015 at a very critical time for his country. Besides his official political endeavor, he's been an active public and political figure globally. He's the co-founder of Progressive International and DiEM25. And he continues to influence global debate on democracy, inequality, and economic justice. Well, Yanis is also the author of various best-selling books, and the most recent of this is Techno-Feudalism, What Killed Capitalism, which was published in 2023, right? This was around the time when we started hearing ChatGPT and AI more and more, right? So the book obviously was written much before that. And today, actually, his talk is titled Cloud Capital, another phrase he introduced. Cloud Capital, what it means for universities and the broader community. And as I mentioned, after his speech, we'll have a Q&A session here. And finally, let me also mention that Dr. Varoufakis is a senior visiting fellow of Mercator-IPC for the year 2024. So thanks for being here. So the floor is yours.
Bunu cebinize takabilir misiniz?
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
My clock. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Sabancı University, to Mercator-IPC, to all of you for being here. Okay, let's begin with the title. Cloud Capital, and something about its impact and connection with university life. It's always a great pleasure for me to come back to university, because in 2015 I exited universities. I still teach 1 day a week to retain my connection with universities, simply because they are so important to me. You can take me out of universities, out of academia, but you cannot take academia out of me, as they say. So this big smile that I have on my face is because I'm in a university setting. But the notion of cloud capital is very close to my heart, because I think that it really makes a very significant contribution to our understanding of the world we live in. This is the topic of my recent book, Techno-Feudalism. So I'll say a few things about cloud capital, about capitalism, about why I think that cloud capital has already killed capitalism. It's not a prediction, it's a diagnosis. It may be an incorrect one, but that's my diagnosis anyway. I'm sticking to it. And then I'm going to connect it to university life, which is not something I've done in the book, but I will do it here simply because I am with you in a great university. So let's begin at the very, very beginning. What is capital? Not cloud capital, capital. It's not money. It's not just an asset. From an economic point of view, and a historical point of view, anything we have produced in order to produce something else is a capital good. Whether it's a fishing rod, a tractor, a steam engine, an industrial robot, capital is a produced means of production. So capital existed from the very beginning of humanity. From the first moment that humans created a tool to do something with, we had capital, which means that capital is much, much more ancient than capitalism. So what is capitalism? Well, let's juxtapose it against feudalism, the previous socioeconomic mode of production, at least in Europe. Feudalism was a system where power stemmed from land ownership. If you owned land, you were a landlord, you were powerful. You had the capacity to extract rent from the people, the peasants, who worked the land. All the great cathedrals of the world, the mosques, the ancient structures that we admire, they're the result of accumulated rent, ground rent that accumulated to those who were privileged enough either to own or to control land. And then capitalism comes in, and this replaces land with capital. There was always capital on land, so there were plows being used under feudalism, under slavery, in ancient Rome, and so on. But it was the ownership of the land that made somebody powerful. With capitalism, it is the ownership of the machines which makes somebody powerful. It could be that they didn't own any land, they rented it from a landlord. So it was the factory owners, the owners of the electricity grids. And so you have this transformation, the great transformation as Karl Polanyi described it, whereby you have power stemming from the ownership of capital, where capital allowed its owner to accumulate not rent, but profit. It's a majestic difference between the two. If you have a building in the middle of Istanbul, and it's got shops and restaurants and companies operating from there, or residences, you just need to do nothing. You go to Izmir, you go to Greece, and you lie down on the beach, and your rent accumulates. And the more competition there is between capitalists who operate, the various bits and pieces of your building, the greater your rent, because the more the capitalists bid up the rents for the building that you own. Competition is excellent for the rentier, for the owner of the building, not so good for the capitalist, because they're being forced by competition to reduce their prices. At least that's the theory of standard free market economics, right? So profit is one thing, rent is another. Profit is a return to blending capital with labor and other raw materials to produce commodities. Rent is a capacity to extract other people's produce on the basis of the ownership of a fixed asset. So capitalism was celebrated by Adam Smith, Friedrich von Hayek, the great gurus of free market capitalism, for shifting power to the entrepreneurs, to the ones who own the capital and mix it with labor and raw materials, away from the rentiers. My hypothesis in this book is that capital has become so triumphant, it has become so successful. Politically, it has decimated opposition to its power, opposition by the left, by socialism, by communism, by political forces that were trying to socialize capital. And I count myself as one of the losers of this because I'm a leftist. I'm saying that so that there are no misunderstandings here, where I'm coming from. Okay, so the left, we lost, capital has won. There's no doubt about that. It triumphed. But my hypothesis is that it triumphed so magnificently that it has mutated. Like a virus that is very successful and then mutates and becomes even more toxic. Remember, COVID-19 was constantly mutating, right? A virus that mutates becomes more toxic. That's what capital has done. It has mutated to a new form of capital, which is unheard of in human history. We've never had such a phenomenon before. I call it cloud capital. It's what lives in our phones, in our laptops, what is in the ether, server farms, optic fiber cables, the cloud, which is capital. Because it's a produced machine, network machine, but it's a produced means of doing things. Except that unlike the plows, the tractors, the industrial robots that I mentioned before, it is not a produced means of production, because it doesn't produce anything. It's a produced means of behavioral modification. What do I mean by that? Behavioral modification has always been part of human societies. The chief of a tribe, the vicar, the bishops, the muezzins, the philosophers, the poets, the authors, the politicians have always tried to modify our behavior. That's called persuasion. If I persuade you that X is not X and it's Y, then and therefore that you should do something different to what you're doing, I've modified your behavior, right? And this is part of dialectics, part of the dialogue between human beings, the clash of views, as Hegel said, the clash between a thesis and antithesis bringing about a synthesis. There's nothing new about that. Under capitalism, after the great transformation that I've already referred to, we had a number of phases with capitalism really seriously transforming itself. The first great transformation within capitalism was when we went from the steam engine to electromagnetism. With Maxwell's equations, we had the possibility of marrying electricity and magnetism, and we created electricity grids and telephone systems and large-scale production and big business. So Thomas Edison was a businessman who was producing everything from the power station to the electric lamp in your home. The whole vertically integrated conglomerate, which is by definition, because of huge economies of scale, exactly the opposite of the baker, the brewer, and the butcher, the small entrepreneurs in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's a very different beast. By 1910, capitalism was nothing like what Adam Smith had in mind when he was proposing competition between smallholders. Okay? So that's one great transformation. The second great transformation comes after 1929, the New Deal in the United States, the war economy, when you had what John Kenneth Galbraith, a splendid economist from the United States, and somebody who had an interesting role during the Second World War. He was President Roosevelt's price czar. His job was to fix every price. And I had the great benefit once of having a discussion with John Kenneth Galbraith many years ago. And I said to him, Professor Galbraith, how did you do that? You know, the American economy is gigantic. How can you set all prices? He said, it wasn't hard. They were already fixed by the cartels. Anyway, that's an aside. Okay. But Galbraith's idea of the technostructure, you can see, I don't know whether you watch Hollywood series, television series, like, you know, one of my favorite ones, not my favorite one. My favorite is Star Trek, by the way, so that you know. One of my favorite ones was Mad Men, that television series depicting the rise of advertising in the 1950s and 60s. And there is this iconic figure, fictional figure, Don Draper, who is half drunk most of the time, a womanizer, a very poor excuse for a human being. But he's brilliant, and he comes up with fantastic advertising campaigns that succeeded in making you buy things that you neither wanted nor needed. That's the hallmark of a of a brilliant advertiser. Why am I saying that? Because Don Draper is a very good example of a behavioral modifier. Somebody whose job is to modify your behavior, to put into your head the idea that, you know what you really crave now is a Big Mac. So go to McDonald's and buy one. even if you don't want one. But that's the success. That's what behavioral modification is in the commercial capitalist, late capitalist, techno-structural period after the Second World War. And we can see that because, you know, these big businesses could produce a lot more stuff than what people wanted to consume. So they had to produce both the commodity and the desire for the commodity. And that was the job of the advertising sector, you know, television advertisements and so on. What's happening with this, with what I call cloud capital, is that Don Draper has been automated. So, when you're talking to Siri, if you have an iPhone, I don't have an iPhone, I can't stand iPhones. It's a constant reason for arguing with my wife who has an iPhone and likes it. But if you have an iPhone, you talk to Siri. You ask it to do things for you. If you have an Amazon Alexa device on your desk, and many people have that, at least in the United States, you can tell Alexa, you can ask Alexa anything you want. You can ask it to translate things for you, to order milk for you from the supermarket, to book tickets for you for the cinema, the theater. You can ask it to switch off the lights, you know, open your garage door if you have one. So it looks like your slave. It ain't your slave. It actually is not an entity. It is connected to cloud capital, to this networked machine that doesn't live in the cloud. It lives in web servers. It lives on optic fiber cables, cell towers, you know, the algorithms of Amazon. It's one integrated piece of machine, and Alexa on your desk, or Siri on your phone, or Google Assistant, or whatever. There are hundreds or thousands of these assistants now. It is there as an interface between you and cloud capital. And what you do when you tell Alexa stuff, or when Alexa is listening to you, I don't know whether you've noticed that. You know, you mention, you know, a new soap powder for a particular stain, and then suddenly Google gives you advertisements for these soap powders. So it listens to you. So you are constantly training Alexa. Alexa is just, I'm using Alexa, it's a nice name. Right? You train Alexa to train you, to train Alexa better, to know you, so that Alexa can give you good advice when you ask for the advice, even if you don't ask for the advice. And the advice is always good, because it has all this information from you. You've trained it. It's pure dialectics. It's an infinite regress. You train it to train you to train it to train you to train it ad infinitum. And then it knows you better than your best friends. And then it can give you good advice. And then it has your trust. So next time it proposes something, that you should be buying this particular soap powder, it's given you so much good advice in the past, you trust it, and you buy it. So, see, Don Draper has been automated. It's not a human being anymore. It is an interface which is totally integrated with you, with your being. You train it to train it to train you to train it to train it. This is one thing. You've become one thing with this thing. You don't realize it, but you have. Now, this is not, I'm not talking about mind control. I'm not talking, this is not a conspiracy theory. I'm not saying that there is any kind of brainwashing. No, but your desires and commands and wishes and requests and Alexa have become absolutely entangled in an infinite regress. And why is this important? It's because, not only because Don Draper has been automated, so the advertising industry is gone, as it used to be. It is now, they make a lot more they have far greater success in making us buy things through this interaction than through standard advertisements. And that's why if you are working in the advertising industry, you'll find that your salaries have gone to the floor compared to what they were in the 1960s and 70s. So advertisers are not making the amount of money that we used to make. In the same way journalists don't. Because journalists and advertisers are being replaced by cloud capital. But it's not just that. The moment Alexa convinces you to buy that particular soap powder, that particular soap powder will come to you through the mail, through a courier. You see, under Don Draper's regime, Don Draper convinced you to buy a Big Mac, and you had to go to the McDonald's to buy it. Don Draper convinced you to buy a Hershey chocolate. You have to go and buy it from Hershey. Right? So Don Draper was working for Hershey. He was getting a cut from Hershey's monopoly profits or oligopoly profits of having managed to create an urge in you for a terrible chocolate called Hershey's. By the way, they're inedible. Don't tell my American friends that. Okay? They're really bad chocolates. But people buy them because of the power of advertising and now the power of cloud capital. But the fundamental thing now is that you don't even go to the vendor, to the seller. The same algorithm of Amazon sells it to you. And you know what it does beyond that? It charges up to 40% of the price you're paying to the producer as a rent. It's a kind of ground rent, like landlords under feudalism used to charge to peasants or to artisans. Because Amazon is not producing anything. Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, produces nothing, unlike Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, of the old capitalist tradition. So my strange, weird, odd, and provocative proposition is that the two pillars of capitalism have now been destroyed without us realizing it by cloud capital. And what are the two pillars of capitalism? Firstly, markets, because Amazon is not a market. It's a trading platform, which is controlled by this algorithm, and there's no decentralization. And the algorithm decides whom you speak to if you are a consumer, whom you sell to if you're a producer. There is no capacity between consumers and producers to talk to one another, to compete. The algorithm decides everything that you do on Amazon.com. After it has input into your soul and to your brain desires that you didn't have before. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not capitalism anymore. Welcome to what I say, techno-feudalism. And the second pillar of capitalism that it has knocked down and replaced, instead of profit being the source of wealth accumulation, as it was until recently, now it's rent again, but cloud rent. Increasingly, vendors on Alibaba, on Amazon.com, all these platforms, on Uber, on Airbnb, on Spotify, increasingly, the surplus value that is accumulated or created is siphoned off by the owners of this cloud capital who are not producing any of it. So we went from feudalism where there was rent to capitalism where there was profit, back to rent, but not ground rent, but what I call cloud rent. And the interesting thing is that the new feudal lords, I call them cloudalists because they own cloud capital, are capitalists. They don't amass all this rent because they have land. No, they have capital, cloud capital, which is a bit like digital land. It's like a digital fiefdom or a cloud fief. That's what Amazon is. It's like an imaginary land, fiefdom, in which we all live as consumers and producers, okay, made of cloud capital, so it's capital, but allowing the owner of that fiefdom, of that space, of that digital cloud space, to extract two things. Surplus value from the producers, from the capitalists, the manufacturers and so on, and free labor from you and me. Because when you go into Amazon.com and you like something, you write a review, you add to the cloud capital of Amazon. When you upload a video on TikTok, on Instagram, you add to their cloud capital. This is your free labor. You may be enjoying it when you're doing it. It doesn't matter. Without you realizing it, you're producing free labor for somebody's capital, cloud capital, to build up. So that's more or less what the book is about. But I promised, because, and I also want to, this is my own desire, because I'm in a university, to link cloud capital with university life. And to draw a parallel between the story I just told you with my experience of universities. I first taught in a university in 1983. From 1983 to 2023. I'm sticking to 23 to keep to the threes, right? Quite a few years, quite a few decades. Now, my first encounter with technology in the university was, well, besides the blackboard, which was a very old and tested and still beloved to me technology, It was the overhead projector, where I would write, you know, my lecture notes on slides, and I would put them on the overhead projector, and I would have a piece of paper that I would move so as to create a bit of interactivity and not show all the equations to my students from the beginning and overwhelm them. Okay. Then, when I was doing my master's thesis at Birmingham University on mathematical statistics, as Jem said. That was when the first time I encountered a piece of, I wouldn't call it cloud capital because it wasn't living in the cloud, but machine learning or machine teaching. I needed to learn Fortran very quickly, to learn it well, because I needed to run a program, an optimization program. And I didn't have time now to attend classes and so on, but my professor told me that there was a digital teaching manual. So essentially, one of the very first algorithmic teaching programs that taught you how to write Fortran programs. It was very basic. It wasn't very clever. It was just, you know, giving you little tasks, checking whether you understood what you did, and then moving to the next chapter. Right? But it was the first time. As a professor, the Don Draper moment of the academic process of evolution, that is when you have behavioral modification coming through new technologies, happened when in the 1990s. When I realized how large corporations can infiltrate university seminars, university lecture theaters, and centralize power for themselves in the teaching process. And I'm going to refer to McGraw-Hill now. You know McGraw-Hill, the publishing house. It was simply a publishing house then. But using the new technologies of the internet that were at their very fledgling level back in the 1990s, I noticed what they did with my large undergraduate microeconomics and macroeconomics classes. Up until then, their salesmen, and they were men, I didn't meet a single saleswoman, they would come to our offices when I was at Cambridge, when I was at Sydney University and so on, and they would sell their textbook, like other publishers. Natural. Because if you know, I had 1,000 students, 1,000 copies of the textbook, that was a lot of money for them. They tried to really convince me that their textbook was better than the one I was using. Natural, okay? But then, it became more complicated, because they would come and make your life as a professor easier. Not only would they sell you the lecture, but they would sell you the textbook online in nice little chunks with little moving pictures, so you could see the demand curve going up or going down. So you wouldn't have to do what I was doing with my slides, or write your own little program that would be very complicated. And then they also added tutorial questions, and that was the crux. That was sometime in 1997. They offered us professors at the University of Sydney, where I was at the time, and the University of Glasgow a year or two later, they offered us tutorials. That is, for our class of students to be able to ask questions to to some poor TAs working for a pittance somewhere in the United States, in Indiana, I don't know where. So, you know, this is a package that's very attractive, because if you say yes to that, okay, and they would offer us money as well to accept it, because they would sell the textbooks to the students, and they would use the lure of all these facilities. Now, this is very attractive. If you want to learn Fortran, like I wanted to learn, these packages may be very, very useful. But when it comes to the broader questions about science, about society, about the economy, what happens when you have this kind of centralization of knowledge and the commodification of knowledge and the corporatization of knowledge? you end up with universities that have been expunged of dangerous ideas, of eccentric ideas, of heretical ideas. And let's face it, today's orthodoxy is yesterday's heresy. If we expunge heretical thinking, quirky thinking, eccentric professors from universities, then we stagnate. Then we lose our capacity to challenge through an evolutionary, if not revolutionary process, the lies that pass for truths today. Because if you look, if you go back 100 years, 200 years, you realize that a lot of stupidity was presenting itself as a sure truth, a certainty in the past. Okay, so the McGraw-Hill example is the equivalent of Don Draper. Concentrated power to modify your behavior. Commodified, capitalized, centralized on the basis of the Thomas Edison model of economies of scale, from the factory producing the electricity all the way to the light bulb, from the textbook writers all the way to the tutorial room near here. With cloud capital, we're facing the possibility of this being automated. Not simply having some TA in Indiana tutoring your students here in Istanbul, but you have AI bots which now converse with students. Well, we know that they write your essays, okay? And they can do a pretty good job at that. And it is becoming now an arms race between professors and students. Students are using increasingly sophisticated AI equipment in order to write essays or to answer mathematical problems, right? And professors are trying to create or to use AI bots that will detect the AI bots that the students use. After a while, we're just going to have AI students being marked by AI professors, and we can all go home and harvest our crops or olives, whatever. But that is not the main concern that I have. The main concern that I have is I trust people to have their own critical judgment, both professors and students, at some point. But what I don't trust is our universities. Because university administrations have a tendency to opt for the simpler, cheapest solution. And the simplest, cheapest solution today is one where, as a species, we are no longer capable of thinking for ourselves. Because at the moment, ChatGPT-4, or 5 or 6, is being trained on creative, eccentric ideas from the past. But if in this process of normalizing and commodifying both teachers and students, because it is the cheapest and most efficient technology, we end up without eccentric, heretical, quirky, revolutionary, dangerous thinking, then very soon the AI bots are going to be trained on the inanities of AI bots. And that's stagnation. That is the end of academia. It is simply the recapitulation of what is being taken for granted. And that's when we stop producing ideas and being useful to society and to humanity. Thank you very much.